We are seeing how these are being extended every now and then. So I keep going back to the same properties, again come back and see generalizations of this. And as I keep repeatedly saying, these are the fundamental properties which would give us many nice results in analysis which are applicable and so on and so forth. Okay. And it is action on such sets by functions which gives results on existence of solutions, or approximations of solutions, or differential, integral, or any types of functional equations, maximization, optimization, all these will be based on these types of sets. So these are experiences gained from the real line, slowly pushed to the level of abstract spaces. So one of the properties, the property, repeatedly used property, at least now, we have been constantly using this property. So far at least we have repeatedly used this. What is that property? That is, if I take Jn, a sequence of closed intervals, so an, bn, real numbers. So it is, I should keep saying that they are closed, bounded closed, finite intervals. That is expressed by the fact that an and bn are real numbers. So I have a sequence of closed intervals such that they are non-increasing, each is contained in the other, and the length which is bn minus an tends to 0 as n tends to infinity, then the intersection is a singleton. This has been repeatedly used. Implies the intersection of Jn, n equal to 1 to infinity, is a singleton. We then generalize this. Later, generalize this for metric spaces. How did we do this? We generalized the notion of closed interval and a closed ball, and then showed the intersection. So what was there? We needed an additional hypothesis, namely that the space must be complete. Cauchy sequences must converge. So if Bn equal to B Rn Xn, I don't know what notation I used, is a sequence of closed balls, Xn belonging to omega t, Rn positive, a sequence of closed balls in a metric, or closed balls in a metric space omega t, such that non-increasing they are non-increasing, and this is basically the diameter of those balls going down to 0. So we wrote it as, diameter of Bn tends to 0 and then tends to infinity. But the diameter is twice the radius, so we wrote this condition as Rn tends to 0. The same as the diameter of the ball goes to 0 as n tends to infinity. And if omega d is complete, in the complete space. This we needed in addition because here in R we were guaranteed it was complete, any Cauchy sequence, converged and so on. Here we needed this. Then intersection Bn n equal to is the singlet. This is the generalization we did for closed balls. Now we are going to push this a little bit. We shall push this further. So what we did here was, we had only real line result. We called it the Cantor intersection property for closed intervals. This was called the Cantor intersection property for closed balls. Now we really come to the so-called Cantor's intersection, the most general and the general version of the Cantor's intersection. Now we want to drop the idea that they are closed balls. Suppose I just only closed sets. Can I still get it? So that is, if Xn is a sequence of closed sets, let me first write what we would ask. Sequence of closed sets in omega d such that 1, it is non-increasing, and we have to replace this condition. So we put a question mark first. Diameter of Xn question mark here tends to 0. We don't know what it means. Okay. And we don't know, here itself we needed completeness, probably we would need completeness, question mark, and if omega d complete, do we need it? Obviously we would need it, because if this result was true without completeness, closed balls or closed sets, it would have come true for incomplete metric space also. So obviously we would need the completeness thing. Then is intersection Xn a singlet. The answer is obviously false, because I could take one of the closed sets to be the empty set. Suppose I take the 100th closed set, X100 to be the empty set, and all the subsequent ones will be empty because it's non-increasing. It cannot be more. So in other words, beyond a certain stage, if they are all empty, the intersection is going to be empty. So the question is meaningless if one of them turns out to be empty. So the question makes sense only if we're dealing with non-empty closed sets. So the question doesn't make sense. Obviously not true if Xn equal to phi for some n, and hence, for some capital N, and hence for all n greater than n. And in such a case, intersection Xn is equal to n. It cannot be a singlet. Okay. So therefore this is false. So to avoid this, we assume that all Xn are non-empty. So now we rephrase our question. I have a sequence of non-empty closed sets. They are non-increasing, and the diameter, whatever that means, goes to 0. Will the intersection be singlet? Now I do not know. It could still be empty. I have to show that it is non-empty. But what first we will observe First of all is to make sense for what is the diameter of the set. Then we will observe that I don't know what the intersection is. I can, first of all I will tell that it will not be more than one point. So therefore there will be only two options, empty or singleton. Then we will show it is a singleton by actually producing a point there in the intersection. So first of all, for this we need to generalize the notion of diameter of a set. Now it's obvious, I mean how to generalize this. What is meant by the diameter of this interval? We call it the length of the interval. In the case of ball we wrote, the diameter was this. Take a circle, the normal circle that you think of into diameter. That is see again we misuse or abuse terminologies. We call that chord as the diameter, and we also call the length as the diameter of the circle. Isn't it misuse? We want to call the chord as the diameter or the length of the chord as the diameter, but we take it for granted. We say the diameter is twice the radius for all our calculations. Then somewhere along the line we will say the diameter is the longest chord. Now suddenly a number became a chord. Okay, this is an abuse of notation and terminology, but everybody understands from the context what we are talking about. See, most of the time that's the problem. We think we understand what the other person is talking about. We never question him. Okay? If you question, all these should be very carefully stated. Anyway, what we mean is that if you take any two points in the circle and calculate its distance and do it for any pair of points, the largest value we get is called the diameter of that set. So now the largest may not exist, the maximum may not exist, so you have to look at the least upper point. So therefore, what shall I write? So we should define diameter of a set X to be, look at all possible pairs of points in that set and look at the supremum of this, the least upper bound. Now, if you take any pair of points, this is a number, it's a non-negative number. So we have a set of non-negative numbers and we are looking at the supremum of that. Well, it could be an unbounded set, in which case the supremum is infinity. So therefore, we had this fact in all these places, this Rn was a real number, this was a bounded set that was hidden there. Okay, I said it's a finite interval, it's a bounded set. So I add xm, suppose x is a bounded set, then diameter of x is the least upper bound. This will all be, this entire set of numbers will be bounded because they will all be put inside a big sphere, and therefore this will be a finite. So diameter of x is a well defined. Otherwise you have to define it as infinite. So therefore our question must be rephrased now. If xn is a sequence of non-empty bounded closed sets, sequence of non-empty bounded closed sets. Now, I wanted to put that because diameter will be defined. But then, the fact that they are decreasing, what does that say about the boundedness? All the diameters will be smaller than the first diameter. So automatically the boundedness is taken care of in a sense, because beyond a certain stage they are all going down to 0. So basically we are asking for a sequence of sets coming down, becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. So the boundedness is somewhere tacitly swallowed. Okay. So then, if we have such non-empty sets decreasing, diameter going down to 0, in a complete metric space, will that be, the intersection be non-empty? So the question therefore is, Cantor's intersection property, if xn is a sequence of non-empty closed sets such that x1, xn plus 1 contained in xn for every n, diameter of xn goes to 0 in a complete metric space. Then intersection xn is a singlet. This is a question we are asking. That will be. So that will be the final generalization of that closed intervals we had. Slowly we pushed it to the level of metric spaces and general closed sets. And the answer is yes. And that is called the Cantor's intersection theorem or the Cantor's intersection. Okay, we'll look at this. Answer is yes. Slowly. Now, first of all, the intersection can be at most one point. So, we are narrowing down. You want to say the number of points is 1, we are saying it is at most 1. It cannot be 2, it cannot be 3, it cannot be 4. So, it is either 0 or 1. So, finally we will settle down to 1. The reason is the following. The diameter is going down to 0. So, if 2 points belong to the intersection, those 2 points will belong to all the sets beyond a certain stage. So, the distance must be less than 1 over n because the diameter is less than going down to 0. So, suppose there exist 2 points x, y in the intersection. Then x, y belong to xn for all n. Why? Because it's in the intersection. So it has to belong to all these. But now diameter of xn tends to 0 implies there exists an n such that diameter of xn is less than epsilon for every epsilon positive. Such that diameter of xn is less than n for every n greater than. Because the diameter is going down to 0, beyond a certain stage you can make it as small as you want. And therefore, n greater than or equal to n implies dxy is less than or equal to diameter of xn because xy belongs to xn, all xn. So, and therefore, and diameter is the largest distance between pairs of points in xn. So, this is any single pair will be smaller than the maximum, but this is less than epsilon. So, this says dxy can be made less than epsilon for all epsilons positive, and therefore implies dxy is less than epsilon for every epsilon positive, but it is greater than or equal to epsilon. Diameter, the distance of that says dxy is 0, which is maximum. So therefore, uniqueness is automatically guaranteed. I mean, if there is something, this may be a vacuous uniqueness. If there were 2, they must be the same. But I don't even know whether there is 1. Okay. So this is sometimes hoodwinking proof that there is 1. You see, there is only 1. I showed you. I have not showed you that there is only 1. I said if there was 1, that is only 1. So there is this uniqueness part is different from existence part. Okay. So now we will show that there is 1. Proof is essentially the same as what we did. I did it by piece by piece by piece because that's the way the mind worked. Slowly from intervals how things were pushed. Each stage we exactly analyze what is the real power of the hypothesis that is used and then extract that only and you get the general result. Okay. So now we establish there exists a point the intersection. Suppose we establish this, we establish there is a point, and we have established there cannot be more than one point, therefore there will be exactly one point, and that's the theorem. Okay, that is the idea of saying that there is exactly one point. Now the proof is as before. I will just recall the proof and just write the steps. We pick one point in each one of these balls, and in fact in our proof we put at the center of these balls, and we showed that those centers form a Cauchy sequence, and completeness is they converge to that something, and we showed that something is what belongs to the intersection. That's exactly what we are going to do this. We are nothing like a center now, because we have only a closed set. So we'll just pick some point. Can we? Yes, because they are non-empty. And axiom of choice says if you have a set of non-empty set, you can pick a point representative from there. So we can, since each xn is non-empty, this is where non-emptiness comes. Okay? We can find an xn belonging to xn. Pick one xn from each xn. The claim, what is this claim 2, isn't it? The sequence xn is this has to be proved or not. Suppose we have it. The sequence xn is a Cauchy. Then by completeness, this is where we need the completeness of the metric space. Limit and then the xn equal to x is this converges to some element in omega. And the claim 3 is that x that's the same line of proof. Same line of proof.
Okay.
Let me again just indicate the proof. So therefore, once we complete this, we get the famous Cantor's intersection property, which is the generalization of the common sense idea we had that if you had a closed intervals, go on squeezing them, eventually they have to collapse into a single point. That common sense idea is pushed all the way up to a abstract metric space. There are no place to go. On both sides there are fellows pushing, and then eventually your two hands must come and hit each other. And that's the limit point. Okay? The greatest lower bound of the right hand points and the least upper bound of the left hand points will have to come and hit each other. And that hitting point is the limit. And that belongs to the intersection. Okay, now what is the idea of the proofs? We want to show that x belongs to the intersection. Now look at this sequence. Now x1, x2, x3, x2. That is my sequence. Now it may so happen, I might have chosen this, I have chosen xn's from xn. I did not put any condition other than that. They could have been, suppose xn had many points. Which one I choose? I didn't put any one you like. Okay, so it may happen, it's a trivial case where he is begging the question. Many of these fellows are repeated. Or in other words, they are so repeated, there are only finite number of them which are distinct. Only finite number of these things are distinct. In which case, one of them at least must have repeat infinitely often. If one of them repeats infinitely often, take that subsequence that already converges, right? That already converges. But the whole sequence itself converges. So if a subsequence converges, the whole sequence must also converge to the same. Once you have a sequence which converges to something, and if a subsequence converges to something, the whole sequence, the subsequence must have the same limit. But you may have a situation where the whole sequence does not converge, but a subsequence converges to something. But in this case, we already have this, the sequence converges, and we then have a subsequence converges to something, and that something must indeed be the limit one. So case 1, only a finite number of these are distinct, in which case one of the terms in the sequence repeats infinitely more. See, actually, once you know the proof, it is so boring to write it, isn't it? I mean, that is where I find at least, I have at least many friends with me who come along with me. We rarely write papers, because once I prove the result, I have lost interest in it. To write all the masala, introduction, references, and you have to write, make it look as though it's a big theorem, and otherwise it's not bought. You have to write and put the most possible general question, and somewhere along the line sneak in enough assumptions so that it becomes a trivial question, and then give a big hyphen of proof for it, and then conclude it with 4 corollaries, 3 remarks, and then have some 22 references, none of which you would have seen ever in your life. So you totally lose the interest. I mean, once you see it, okay. But it reminds me of a lecture once given by, Professor Nagendra, who was in the mechanical engineering department in the good old days, in the early 70s. Then left everything. In fact, I had a very interesting experience with him. He came on one Monday morning at 8:30. Those were the days when I used to come at 8:30. And he would come and he met me, sir, I have a student, his comprehensive exam is to be conducted. I have put your name as one of the examiners. Is next Monday okay? I said, okay, any time is okay. I am most of the time here in the institute only. You just send me the letter, when it is, I will come there. Then next Monday came, nothing happened. I didn't get any letter. The next Monday came, nothing happened. Then suddenly I noted down in my diary this examination. I said, what happened? So I called the mechanical engineering department and asked for Nagendra. They said, Nagendra has left the institute. So he just joined the Vivekananda Kendra here in Bangalore. He is there, he has been ever since there. What is that place called?
Vyoma.
Huh?
Vyoma,
Yeah, that place is called Jigni. So he gave a nice lecture once. We had a conference on various things, neuros networks and things like that. So he gave one instance of, he described something that there is a guru and he has a student. And then the guru asks him some questions. Then the student asks the guru some question. The guru says, you go and meditate on this question at this place, think about it along these lines. You will get the answer. After some time, he comes back. He has some more doubts. He sends him backward with some more suggestions and then asks him to meditate. This goes on for a while. And after some time, the student doesn't come back. The guru doesn't know the answer. He wants to know. But the student has found the answer, he no longer wants to come back with it. So it is like that. I found it. So it is like that. I found the answer, I no longer want to come back and write. This happens to people. I know several people who said, oh, I have an answer, I know the result. I knew it long back. Whether they are bluffing or not, there is a chance for bluffing also. But there are some people who simply don't care. Once it is, they don't like this formalism of the journals, the formalisms that the journals force on you. I don't like to do all this. Okay, so like, see, for example, if I write a proof, I want to write all this because I want to communicate to the reader how I thought about this proof, what went through my mind, where I failed, how I corrected, where did I bring in this proof hypothesis. But the journal doesn't want it. The journal simply wants statement of the Cantor intersection property, proof, lemma, that thing, and then you say that this is it's over. It is somewhere along the line you should say it is easy to prove that, and then okay, so that's and in fact, once I had a quarrel with one of the journals which had a title, which title started with communications blah blah blah, right? So this fellow said, no, this is all. I said, you want to communicate, isn't it? I have communicated. If I don't write all this, I am not communicating what went through my mind. So I want it in this way. If it is acceptable, you take it, otherwise forget about it. Okay, so you sometimes happens like that. Okay, anyway. It happens many times with the students, they come, ask them questions, we give them some idea. Probably this will work, why don't you try? If he comes back, it means it didn't work. If it works, he never comes back and tells me that it worked. I would have liked to know how it worked. Okay, anyway. And this, I'll just write, this automatically becomes. The limit of the sequence. Does it prove anything? What are we trying to prove?
No, it is belongs to.
We must say that it is in the intersection. Still we haven't got it.
Because it's decreasing actually.
Because the sequence of such is decreasing. So what you want to do is, what does this mean? This simply means there exists a sequence of positive integers n1 less than n2 less than n3 etc. going off to infinity such that xn1 equal to x, xnj equal to for every nj. That is what is meant by saying infinitely often the same thing repeats. So here is xn1, that is x, here is xn2, that is x, and it goes on like that. Right? And now I want to show that this x belongs to the intersection. Finally our problem is to show that that x belongs to the intersection. Now what happens? Suppose to show that x belongs to xn for all, this is what we have to show. Then only it belongs to the intersection. Okay? Now take any m. Certainly, there exists nk such that nk is greater than, because nk is fly off to infinity. For some nk, it has to be greater than infinity. And therefore, xnk is x. Because all these xnj's are x. But belongs to xnk. Now, but xnk is contained in xn. Why? Because these sets are decreasing. These sets are decreasing. Here is xn and nk is greater than n. So xnk will be somewhere here and x is sitting here and therefore x will sit there also. And therefore x also belongs to x. And we are done. Okay. So therefore, if the same term infinitely repeats often, what it means is belongs to it. It has been chosen from the same, that same element has been chosen from all the sets. Okay, for a number of jumps. But if it is in that, it's also in all the previous ones. If it is in this, it's there on all the previous ones. It sweeps off all the other sets also simultaneously, and therefore it belongs to all the sets and hence the intersection. Now what is the other case? I think I told you this story also once. This referee is a very, very senior man at the university, at the Los Alamos laboratory. He became a very good friend of mine after this incident. I wrote one paper. As usual, my theorem was almost at the end of the paper. I went on discussing a lot of things, and then finally I concluded my discussion as a theorem. And this referee wrote to me saying that there are too many details in this paper, it must be cut down. So I cut it down to so terse a level and sent it back. Again it was sent to both the referees. There are two referees, both the referees. Now the second referee said, this paper is too terse. The author may argue that an interested, I still have those these things with me, comments. I almost remember the exact words. The author may argue that the interested reader must work through the details himself. But he must also remember that the interested reader may have many other interests. So, now I sent it back to the editor asking him, do you want my paper to be aimed at those readers who have other interests? Or those readers who do not have time to read more than 2 pages? Please decide by yourself and then send me what you want me to do. Until then I don't want to look at it. You make sure what is your policy. And this first gentleman who said the paper was very long, he was one of the editors of the journal, so he became a very good friend of mine. He really nailed us and sort of made us awake that what kind of comments that we are getting and you are writing. We really don't understand. I mean, many times we don't understand what's going on in the mind of the author. From now on, I will first vet through most of the referees' reports and then send it to the others. So it does happen sometimes, you don't know what to write and what not to write. Whatever you write, they will say something wrong. If you write more, they will say it is too much. If you write less, they are not given the details. So best thing is to hold back the details and write it. This is an advice. Write a very terse paper. And the referee will try for half an hour, he will not be able to prove some of those things. Then he will say, ask for the detail. The reader should give more details. If you give the details, then he will say that he has given too many trivial details. Now he has seen it, he thinks it is trivial. So don't give it to him, hold it, write a terse paper always. The referee must struggle, then realize there are certain non-trivial things here. Okay, therefore I should look at it carefully. If you give all the details, you are finished. I mean, you are no longer any negotiation chances. Unfortunately, these things should not happen in academics, but they do happen. Okay, what is the other case? Okay, the other case is infinite number of them of the Excel Okay, now I'll leave it as an exercise. Show in this case also. Now what happens in this case? Now I have an infinite subsequence, each a term of which is distinct. I can choose a subsequence such that every term is different. Where will that subsequence go? That subsequence will go to X, which means essentially if you take the point X and draw a sphere about it, infinite number of those fellows will have to go and sit there. If infinite number of fellows sit there, you show that the infinite number of every one of those fellows will sit there. Okay, and that point will become a limit point for that set. If it becomes a limit point, it's a closed set, the limit point will belong to that set. Maybe I should point this out. More than that. Okay, let's see. Suppose infinite number of the xn's are distinct. What does that mean? That is, there exists n1, n2, etc. positive integers, n1 less than n2 less than n3, etc. such that xnj is not equal to xnk for nj not equal to nk. Okay? Infinite number of them are distinct. So let's mark them here. Here is xn1, here is xn2, and so on it goes on. All these fellows are distinct. These xn1, xn2, xn3, xnk are all distinct fellows. There are infinite number of them. So they need not be the first, second, third, fourth. Maybe the first 10 terms are the same. Then suddenly a new fellow comes. Then the same fellows keep coming. And at the 21st term another new fellow comes. Then the 28th fellow another new fellow comes. There must be an infinite number of new fellows. That's what we have assumed. Okay, there are an infinite number of distinct fellows in that. So there is a subsequent. Therefore, the subsequence xnj converges to x because the whole sequence converges to x. Okay? If the sequence converges to x, any subsequence will also converge to. So x and k converges to x. Therefore, given any epsilon positive, b epsilon x, there exists, what should I call, nj, some name, nj naught, okay, such that nj greater than or equal to nj naught implies b epsilon x contains an infinite, implies x and j belongs to b epsilon x. Okay, beyond a certain stage, all the members of the sequence should belong to that ball. If you have sequence converging to x, beyond a certain stage, all of them will go and crumble in that, crash into that neighborhood. Now what stage? That depends on what epsilon is. So what this says is, again, let me put, this is this nj naught. If you go to this side, all the fellows we picked are in this part. All the fellows we picked are going to fall in this part. Okay. Now what does that mean? What can I say about nj greater than or equal to nj naught means bnj is contained or equal to in bnj naught. Why? Because they are all shrinking sets. All the b's are shrinking sets. Therefore, if xnj belongs to this, these xnj's are also points of bnj naught. So therefore, it says now xnj belongs to bnj, that is contained in bnj naught. So all these xnj's belong to bnj naught.
What is BNJ?
bnj is that sphere. We started with, you said xnj, the sets
Yeah,
were called
xnj.
xnj. Okay. The sets were called xnj. Okay? So what this says is, all these points belong to xnj naught and they are in this sphere. Which means, any ball around that point x naught has an infinite number of points of xnj naught. Therefore, x must be a limit point of xnj naught.
Why do you say NJ? NJ naught will vary, right?
No, given any epsilon, I want to show, I want to show that x is a limit point of some xnj naught. Okay, your objection is that this is depends on epsilon. Okay, I agree. I will put a question mark here. There is a slight adjustment that you have to make. Okay. But what I am trying to say, there is some point beyond which it will be a limit point of x and j naught. Okay. I will leave it as a, that's why I left it as an exercise. Okay. His objection is right, there is a certain amount of messing up of the epsilons and the nj naughts. But that can be set right, that's not a problem. So what I am trying to say is, the x will become a limit point of x and j. But what I have assumed about x and j, they are closed. So x will belong to x and j. Now the fact again x belongs to x and j, that will say it will sweep out all the previous fellows. And do it for every stage, you will eventually get x belongs to, x is a limit point of every one of the sets, and therefore x will belong to every one of these sets, and therefore x will belong to this. Okay. So the idea of the proof, I am going to leave it at this. The idea is to show that x is a limit point of every x and j or something, and hence x belongs to R, then to R x. Okay, these are the steps of three proofs. First you show that beyond a certain stage it happens, and as in the previous case, one stage it happens, it will sweep out the previous stages. In the next stage it happens, it will sweep out the previous stage, and so on and so forth. Yes, your objection is right. I didn't want to write that epsilon part properly. You are right. You should read it carefully. I am glad that you are awake to these sort of subtleties. Okay, now what about this? I want to prove that it was a Cauchy. Why is it Cauchy sequence? Very obvious. Beyond a certain stage, they will all be in xn, but the diameter of xn is small, so the distance between xn and xn will be very small. So beyond a certain stage, all of them go and fall in a set with very small diameter, and therefore the distances will also be very small, and therefore beyond a certain stage, the distance between any two of them will be small. Okay, this follows from diameter xn tends to 0 and the decreasing nature. Okay. Right. So that's an important property, the Cantor's intersection property, that it will have that things in this is viewed in many ways. Okay. The same intersection property will be viewed in many ways, and it leads to very many interesting results in analysis. Little slow, but anyway, I wanted to finish something, begin something. The reason for this is, I think, looking at this, not wasting time for sometimes. Very important. At least now I'll state a few things. Some of these things are true or not, depends on the time. So what have we got? So finally, that the interval shrinking business and giving me a point, closed intervals, has been generalized to closed non-empty set shrinking and giving rise to a point. That is the essence of that result. The essence of that, these fellows coming and banging, is this. All the other things are frills that we had got. Okay? All you needed was the closeness and etc. and the non-emptiness, the diameter going down to 0. Now similarly, I am going to look at another result that we had in the real line and slowly push it and then extract the essence out of it. And that leads us to the notion of compactness in a metric space. So, recall again. We had Bolzano-Weierstrass property in R. What was the Bolzano-Weierstrass property in R? Every bounded infinite set in R has at least one limit point. That is the Bolzano-Weierstrass property in R. Now, what was it generalized to? than a Weierstrass property in a metric space omega t. We have to replace this notion of boundedness by a notion of total bounded. So every total bounded, every totally bounded set in R, I'm sorry, totally bounded infinite set in omega t am I right?
Complete.
No. The complete matrix. Because always we got that Cauchy sequence and got stuck, and then to go to that limit point we needed that completeness. So we introduced the notion of total boundedness. Now when we introduce the total boundedness, one of the simplest examples I gave for total boundedness was the closed interval. We said in R, but in R every bounded set is totally bounded. In particular, in R, what does that mean? This means for every, if O is any collection of intervals of length, or even what did I'll just write a total boundedness definition, okay? For every epsilon positive, there exists a finite number of points, x1, x2, xn. As I pointed out, the number of points will depend on epsilon, and the points themselves will also depend on epsilon, such that if you look at these intervals and look at the union, and they will converge. Okay, that's what is. So in other words, you can make finite nets of. You decide the length of the net, mosquito net, and then you can make a finite number of them and put those nets, and thereby all your fellows will be protected from the. So all of them would have been covered. I recently visited Mysore and saw sericulture farm. They were having these nets to protect the cocoons from chikungunya mosquitoes. Okay, so I told him we are doing a total bounded cover for these cocoons, and he got interested in what total boundedness is. Okay. So this business of putting through a finite number of fellows is because finally all said and done, man is comfortable only with finite number of things. Very uncomfortable with infinite number of things. And even with infinite, he grudgingly will allow countably infinite number of things. In fact, there was I don't know how many of you attended those lectures in mathematics department last week on cryptography. Nobody attended. It was a nice lecture from someone from IMC. Meera Mahajan from Madras Institute of Mathematical Science. Lots of questions about complexity, computability, and things like that. How many of you are in computer science? You know, you heard about the Church-Turing hypothesis? What is the Church-Turing hypothesis? It's a very vague statement. See, unfortunately, I tried to find out several books. And several people have talked, find out what is this, why is it getting a big name like Church-Turing hypothesis? It's a very vague statement, still I feel it's a vague statement. Okay. Anyway, it's given a name called Church-Turing hypothesis. To me it is like a tautology. Okay. So what they say is that they tell us what is computability. And then say that this is computable, this is not computable, this is not computable. Or this is computable and that is not computable. And there are various definitions of computability. And like one is through algorithmic, the other one is through a halting Turing machine situation. And so there was some calculus developed, post is called post calculus. A number of various ways of defining the notion of computability itself. Then suddenly they said all these are equivalent. Now what is all? I know only 4 or 5. So far only 4 or 5 formal definitions of computability has been given, and it turns out they are equivalent. But that doesn't in any way tell that somebody will come up with totally non-Churchian notion, the whole business of non-Churchian computability and or non-Turing computability. I mean, whether the computer scientists agree or not, that is because they are used to only this. Write an algorithm, write a program, get the numbers cranked in finite number of steps. No, but a genius like Ramanujan gets it in one step. There is no algorithm. Here is an integral, here is the answer. Where is the algorithm, where is the program for it and things like that. So therefore, does the brain really work as a Churchian computability situation or a non-Churchian computability? I don't know. I mean, the thing is, probably most of us are dumb. So we have been brainwashed to think that is because right from the class days you say you must write all the steps, then only you will get marks. You see, you write the answer, you will not be given marks. Do you remember that? Where are the steps? Why? We, I, you and I do. Hoi. You have to give reason. So therefore, we have been brainwashed to think that is the way to compute. And therefore this is computable or that is not computable. Or so it's not at all clear to me what is computable. Now one vague statement somebody makes that what Church-Turing hypothesis says is that any notion of computability, any reasonable, so finally they are modified, any reasonable, what is reasonable which falls in my category, that's a tautology again. Any notion of computability that a human brain may think of will be equivalent to the already existing notion of computability to the halting problem of the Turing machine. Now that I think is a far-fetched statement. How can you say that anything that the human mind can think of will eventually come and fall in this class? In fact, geniuses don't think that way at all. Their whole way is non-algorithm. They just get a flash in the answer. Okay, so, but unfortunately we are always stuck to finite things because that's what we lazy fellows can ask a machine to do and sit happily punching our cards 30 years back, now in front of the keyboard nowadays, whatever it is, because we want always to be masters and ask a slave to do the job. And if I want to make a slave to do the job, I must teach the slave. What can I teach? Only what I know. I know only finite things. That's where we are stuck. So it is not that the computer is dumb, or a machine will be dumb, or a finite automaton is dumb. The problem is we can create only dumb automatons because we are dumb. And I think that's where we are in a very complex situation as to understanding how the brain works. I think somewhere along the line, all research must be directed towards that, how the brain works. And it may end up in a Gödel's incompleteness situation. We may not be able to understand how the brain works. Having a brain, to analyze that brain, we may end up in a Heisenberg uncertainty principle. And I think these are the most serious matters now that is attracting the attention of many people. They are worried about, are we going in the right direction of these matters. Okay, anyway. So let's get back to what we said. So I gave an example that any closed bounded interval is totally bounded. That means for any epsilon, you can find a finite set of next. But if you recall the proof, we did even better. We didn't even bother about any What we showed was that if we have any open intervals that cover J, we can extract finite number of them. So actually we showed if O, let me use the word I. Obviously I am going to use O for something else soon. If I is any collection of open intervals that cover J, then a finite subcollection will cover J.
Will cover.
And hence this will follow. Because with each point of in J, construct an interval like this, that will give an interval cover for J, a finite number of them will cover. So that will be a trivial situation. We said that any interval cover for J will have a finite subset. This is what we prove. Now we start from here and we push and make it as general as possible, and that leads us to the notion of compound. The next level, see what we did was we wanted intervals, uniformly sized intervals to finite number of them. That is very relevant. You take any intervals, you can get a finite number of them, uniform or non-uniform. You can always get a finite number of them to cover J. And the next we show Y intervals. Why not I simply take open sets? Okay, that's the next generalization. So the next generalization is we ask, given any collection O of open sets that cover J, will a finite number of these cover J. So what we did was, now we are just, in fact, if you know the structure of open sets, it's the same question, but we are not yet studying the structure of open sets, so it doesn't look like the same question. So here we get a collection of open intervals which cover J, and we wanted a finite number of them. Now we are giving a collection of open sets, not necessarily open intervals that cover J, and we want a finite number. The answer is yes. We'll come back to this question. Whenever I say J, I have this finite closed interval. Okay. That's essentially what is known as Heine-Borel theorem or something like that. Then we push our luck. If you analyze the proof, eventually you find that the fact that it was an interval was irrelevant. As before, we went from interval to closed ball and said that interval or closed ball was not important, that it was closed was important. So, the next question was that, well, instead of a closed interval, finite interval, I take a closed bounded set. So, the next question was generalize further. Next generalization. Given any collection O of open sets for a bounded closed set X can be by a finite number of these. And the answer is yes. We take a closed bounded set in the real line, or being all in the real line. I am talking about intervals, open sets in the real line. Suppose you take a closed bounded set on the real line, and you give me any damn open cover for that. That is, any collection of open sets, such that if you put them together, you will have all the J, probably more, or all the X and probably more. So suppose you have given a covering for this, you will always end up with a finite number. So this is the counterpart of saying that you give me any spanning set for a subspace in a finite dimensional space, there will be always a finite subspanning set. If you give me any spanning set for a subset. See here you have the real line. In place of the real line you have the vector space. You have the topology here, you have the algebra here. You have a topological cover here. You have an algebraic cover here. That is, you can do topological operations to get this, set theoretic operations to get x. There you can do the algebraic operation to get the subspace, which is linear combining them. Then you have the types called covered by finite always. And here we get the covered by, algebraically covered by finite. Okay. This is the compactness, there it is the finite dimensionless. So idea why they are same. Eventually you want to extract finite fellows who will do the job for you. You give me anything that does the job, a finite number of fellows will do the job. It's like a government office. You have so many people employed there, you extract an empty set, it will do the job much better than every other put together. So that is the next question. So this is essentially this sort of extracting finite things, finitely generated abelian ring, depends on what is the operation allowed there. With respect to the operation algebraic, topological, or both algebraic and topological, whatever is allowed there, if we can extract finite, that is something that I can handle because the finite has come. The moment finite has come, I am very happy. Now I can prove a lot of theorems there, I can work with them, I can compute with them and so on and so forth. And that's the idea. So we want to extract finite, and therefore this extracting this finite number of fellows is taken as a very special property. We then give the definition. Now you see, therefore, in this part, the way I have stated, there is nothing like real line or anything like that. I could ask this question in a metric space. Given, I could ask this question, given any collection of open sets for a bounded closed set X, can we find a finite number of these that cover X? This statement would have made sense even in a metric space. So now we ask, in a metric, same question, in a metric space. Given any open cover for a bounded finite, closed set, will it have finite cover? We can easily construct an example. I will give you the example next time. In general, the answer is no. It's like this: if we are an infinite dimensional space, general vector space, and you take a subspace, and if you give infinite number of vectors that cover it, you may not be able to extract a finite number of them which cover it, because the subspace may also be infinite dimensional. So you may not be able to extract finite number of them. Same situation, similar such situation may take place here. And therefore, this property is a very important property. It is not always there. So therefore, wherever it happens, we must extract. So therefore, what we say is, this leads to definition. When it does not always happen, but it happens in a large class of where the results are obtained because of this, you come up with a definition. In a metric space, omega d, a subset X is called a compact set. The word compact because it's always compactly packed in a finite number of suitcases. Whatever sized suitcase you give me, however many you give me, I can always find a finite number of them in which I can compactly pack this set. Okay? So it's called a compact set if that property, if from every collection of open sets that cover X, we can find a finite subcollection. This is like looking at finite dimensional subspaces in infinite dimensional space. Okay. This is exactly like looking at that. The algebraic version of this is finite dimensional subspaces of infinite dimensional spaces. Okay. Now what we have got here is, therefore, the moment you take any bounded closed set on the real line, it is compact. Because for a bounded closed set, we can always do it in the real line. So this is all in R. Up to this is R. Then we ask in the matrix. So what we have got here is, in R, bounded closed, the set is bounded closed implies is compact. The set is bounded and closed means it is compact. So it is on compact sets, the continuous functions have all nice properties and we get all our analysis results because of that. And it turns out in R, I am just summarizing all the results that we may prove in subsequent classes. This is the line of thinking. This is the line of generalization that will go. We always have a simple thing in R and we just sweep it out to the right questions. Turns out is also. That is, when it is compact, it is also closed and bounded. So, compactness and closed and boundedness are synonymous in the real life. When you say closed and bounded, you mean compact. When you say compact, you mean closed and bounded. Therefore, compact and closed bounded are synonymous. But not so in a general matrix space. We will see examples for this. Now what do you expect will be synonymous?
Complete.
What do you expect will be synonymous? Compact is one notion. Here we are closed and bounded. What do you expect in a metric space? Closed. What was the generalization of bounded that led to Bolzano? The total boundedness. So, in a metric space, compact and closed total bounded are synonymous. So in other words, this is a sort of Heine-Borel theorem for a metric space. Yeah, I mean, we will come back to those questions. What I said, we expect. What do we expect in a metric space? This is probably the correct thing to expect. Then you will find when you prove it somewhere along the line you are stuck with some completeness or not there, Cauchy thing, then you put that. But a natural thing is to start with this. This is perhaps the most reasonable thing to expect, because even in our experience with Bolzano Weiss class, we thought that we found that the boundedness was not working. We need a little more refined version of the notion of boundedness, which was total boundedness. Probably if you use that refined version, probably it will work. So we would like to look at whether compact, closed and totally bounded sets are compact. This is the basic ideas about compactness. See, we have not even gone to metric spaces. We stick only to general topological spaces. We restrict our discussion only to metric spaces. So, the whole idea of compactness is essentially, finally, if you give me a huge amount of information, topological information about that set, a finite number of them are enough, the rest of them are redundant. This is what we most of the time do. Okay? This is what brings back to my original question, that when you write a paper, you would probably almost use infinite number of words, but a finite number of words would have said this is what the result is. But we write a lot of unnecessary things. Okay. This is again our training. Unless you write one paragraph, at least you won't get 2 marks. So write as many words and as many lines, because see, our questions will be explain bracket in at least 100 words. So the number of words is important. Explain in at least 100 words what osmosis is. So it is irrelevant whether you explain what osmosis is or not. You must use 100 words. That's what has been pumped into our mind. So we write more unnecessary things. We write compactness is the reverse. You want only the essence. There is always a finite essence. Whatever information is given about the topology, there is a finite essence of the FET, and that leads us to the notion of compactness. Okay. Probably I will start discussing all this step by step. What we have done is the characterization of compact sets on the real line. They are closed and bounded sets. How do I check whether a set is compact? It is whether it is closed or bounded. Now when I go to general metric spaces, I have to look at essentially this the notion of closed and total boundedness. Now we have to look when we take specific metric spaces. Like if I take the real line, for me total boundedness is the same as boundedness. So there is nothing new. I know what is new. But suppose I take all continuous functions. That's my metric space. Okay. Suppose I take all continuous functions as my metric space. The distance on an interval 0, 1, and the distance between any two functions is defined as the maximum of fx minus gx that we have seen. Suppose I take that metric space. What do you mean by total boundedness? We have put for every epsilon there, this, that and all. But I have functions, I have to verify. I have given a set of functions which is continuous in 0, 1. How do I know that set is totally bounded or not? I have to state my result finally in terms of functions, isn't it? So when I come to such specific metric spaces, my answers must be in terms of the specific concrete fellows. Sometimes it is very easy to deal with abstract. In fact, that is why most of the time this abstract functional analysis is called soft analysis. And when you work on a very specific space and start doing your calculations there, it is called hard analysis. Because sometimes it's easier to talk about abstract, much more difficult to talk about the concrete. See, it's like you can say what is cancer, but give a cancer patient, treat him, that is more difficult. You say generally in cancer cells grow and they may grow at some average rate on which goes by the Gaussian, it follows the central limit theorem. Some such statements we can make. But finally a cancer patient doesn't want your central limit theorem, I want it cured. Okay? That's hard analysis. So there is hard analysis and soft analysis. So this is the soft part of it, looking at the notions holistically. Then the hard part is at the individual levels, how do they look like? So what my next, after this notion of compactness, immediately I will get to the notion of functions and continuous functions. That's where all will come to. Then we come to continuous. There are umpteen number of notions of continuity. And each one depends on what is it that you want. When we say continuous means, the difference at 2 points can be made reasonably small, but the 2 points are reasonably close. See that what is reasonable to you is going to give different definitions. What is in the reasonably close of these two function values, you have to tell me what is reasonable to you. And when these 2 points are reasonably close, you have to tell me what do you mean by these 2 points are reasonably close. What is reasonable to you? And each one of that is going to give us a different definition of continuity. So we will have a notion of continuity at a point. Then we will have a notion of uniform continuity. Then we will have a notion of uniformly continuous, which is called equicontinuous, and it is that holds the key for total boundedness. So, in the next 5 minutes, I'll just show you what all this means, okay? And then we'll be able, when we do all this, start doing the details of all this, you will at each stage know which direction we are heading. I will just start with a very simple notion of continuity. Let us take, for example, just the interval 0, 1 and even the, first of all, a function which is defined from 0, 1 to r. Real valued continuous function defined for 0, 1, x between 0. Now, you take a point t naught. Then we say f is continuous at t naught. If what? When the points are close to t naught, the values are close. That's all. So how close? You decide how close you want. When there exists the other closeness, such that whenever the points are close within this, the values are close within this. You want the values of the function to be reasonably close. This is the reasonableness that you accept. Then I will say that the points must be reasonably close. This is my reasonableness. Now, you note that this delta will depend on at which point you are talking about continuity and what level of accuracy you want. So you have, it will depend on t naught and epsilon. Talk about t naught and epsilon. Now, supposing I have one delta will watch for all t naught. It is irrelevant. Whatever t naught you look at, the same delta work. This is called continuity at t naught. The next is f is uniformly continuous in the interval. If for every epsilon there exists a delta which depends only on epsilon, such that it doesn't matter where you choose these 3 points, as long as they are within delta distance, you will be within. Whichever 2 points in that interval 0, you choose any arbitrary 2 points within a delta distance, the values will be within epsilon distance. That is called uniform continuity. Is that right? The same delta will work. So in the previous case, you have to fix that t naught and hang around within the delta distance of t naught. Now I give you the freedom. You go anywhere you want, but if the two of you hang around within a distance delta, your values will have to hang around within a distance epsilon. That's what is uniform continuity. Right? The next notion is, supposing, okay, one of the main results is that if you have a function like this, whenever it is continuous at every point, it will also be uniformly continuous. In a closed interval, in a closed bounded interval, in a compact set, if f is continuous, it will be uniformly. That is where the compactness is a lot of interesting thing. Okay? If f is continuous in not only in a closed bounded interval, what are the generalization of the closed bounded interval? The compact set. If f is continuous on a compact set, it will always be uniformly continuous. Okay. So f continuous on 0, 1. When we say continuous on 0, 1, means it is continuous at every point. F uniformly continuous. Next, what I do? Let us look at what is this? I'm not no longer going to consider one continuous function in 0, 1. I'm going to consider the collection of all continuous function on 0, 1. Now, suppose, what is the distance between any 2 points in this? It defined as maximum of ft minus gt, t belonging to 0. The maximum will exist because you have a continuous, that all will be proved later. It is all properties of continuous. Now, I take a sub-collection of this. I take a sub-collection for this. That means I got several continuous functions on 0, 1. Each one of them is uniformly continuous. So for every f in x, the following happens. For every epsilon positive, there exists a delta which now depends on that function I am talking about and the epsilon, such that mod t1 minus t2 is less than delta implies mod ft1 minus ft2 is less than epsilon. Now suppose I can choose the delta which works for all f. The same delta which works for all f. So now we said it work for all points. Now we reach the next stage. Well, it worked for all points, but I know too many functions. I want the same delta for all f. Then you have the uniformly continuous collection of functions. That essentially leads to the notion of equivalence. If I'll just use the word uniformly, that would have been appropriate one. If delta can be chosen, if x is such that delta can be chosen independent of f, that is, for every epsilon greater than 0, there exists a delta depending only on epsilon, such that mod t1 minus t2 less than delta implies mod ft1 minus ft2 is less than epsilon for every f in x. Then x is called, I will use this word, non-standard word, uniformly continuous collection. The first uniform comes from the fact that the same delta can be uniformly chosen in any part of the interval. The second uniformly comes from the fact that the same delta can also be chosen uniformly for all the members of that collection. That is what is meant by uniformly continuous. So if we have essentially this sort of uniformly continuous, and that is what is essentially the total boundedness in the space of continuous functions. We will have to look at. I mean, there is, in fact, one of this is what finally was the key point in proving the existence of solutions for initial value problems in differential equations. Finally, the Picard's method and the convergence of the Picard's method all follow eventually from this sort of analysis. There is a compactness that comes. So what is happening here is that compactness plays a very important role when you are going to deal with a collection of functions. In the most of our analysis in the application, whether it is differential equations or integral equations or integral differential or any functional setup that you make, it may be even a discrete setup of equations, you are eventually going to look at certain possibilities, and then you want to eventually locate that I will go on making guesses and land on the solution. That guessing and the guessing will converge, at least some subsequence will converge, and eventually will get a solution. All depends on how your guess set was. There should be some sort of compactness that should come into the picture, and therefore you must precisely know what your collection of fellows in which you are seeking the solution, what is the topology. In that topology, the structure is good enough for all these nice things to happen, And that's what all these approximations are all about. These topological ideas come into fixing up all the niceties about these approximations. Okay, so my next few classes will be along this direction. Compactness, whatever I said now, formalize those ideas, then get into the space of continuous functions and look at all these notions here. Okay, now there is one small thing that I want to discuss, which we will have to discuss soon, really not sooner or later, sooner, maybe before the next class. Because after the next class, it will be August, and then mornings are wiped out because all these regular classes. Though this is not an irregular class, because not open does not mean closed. Okay, so it's like that. Not a regular class does not mean it's an irregular class. So we'll have to find a suitable timing to. Many times you have no notion, no idea of limit. You work with the lim-ins or the lim-sups. Okay, that is